On August 5, 2025, a Medevac King Air came within just 950 feet of landing at Chinle Municipal Airport and never made it. 4 people, 2 pilots, a flight nurse, and a paramedic, all gone in a split second. The weather was clear, it was daylight, and yet, somehow, this happened. So what exactly was going on that day, and what are the very real challenges that could turn a routine approach into a disaster? Let's break down what we know, and what we still don't. This wasn't just any light twin out on a casual trip. This was a Beechcraft King Air 300, tail number November 534 Alpha Whiskey, built in 1988. If you don't know the King Air family, these are workhorse turboprops. They're used everywhere from corporate transport to military liaison flights, and they're especially common in medical evacuation because they can handle short runways and cruise fast enough to cover big distances quickly. The operator was CSI Aviation, a respected Part 135 air carrier out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. They've been around for more than 4 decades, and until this, they had a spotless record. No reportable accidents in their history. That's rare in this business, and they don't hire low-time pilots looking to build hours. Their hiring minimums are basically airline level. 1,500 hours total time, 800 hours in multi-engine aircraft, and at least 500 hours as second in command. So, these aren't rookies. These are professionals trusted with some of the most demanding flying. On this flight, the crew was made up of Captain Jeffrey Tuning, First Officer Amanda Benson, Flight Nurse Camelia Kami Chavez, and Flight Paramedic Nicholas Mancuso. Their mission was to pick up a patient from Chinle Hospital. No patient was on board yet. They were inbound, empty in the back, except for their medical gear and oxygen bottles. And that's important to note, because oxygen bottles can make post-crash fires a whole lot worse. And before we go any further, we need to recognize that these 4 people were in the business of saving lives. Medevac flying isn't glamorous. It's high stress, it's on demand, and it's often into small airports or tough weather. They were doing a job that very few people can do, and fewer still are willing to do. This is why the loss hits hard, both for their families and for the communities they served. Chinle Municipal Airport, or E91 in FAA shorthand, is not a big, bustling facility. It sits out in the Navajo Nation at 5,550 feet above sea level. It's got 1 runway, running north-south, labeled 1836. That's about 6,922 feet long, but only around 60 feet wide. 60 feet might sound fine on paper, but for a King Air pilot used to seeing 100 to 150 foot wide runways, it can feel like threading a needle, especially if the wind is pushing you sideways. There's no parallel taxiway, so after landing, you have to back taxi on the runway to get to the parking area. There's no control tower, and no on-site weather reporting station like AWAS or ATIs. That means you're relying on weather data from other airports and on visual cues like the windsock. And that can be tricky. Conditions can change between your last report and your actual landing, and in remote areas like this, you just have to adapt on the spot. On the day of the crash, the closest weather data came from Window Rock Airport, about 37 miles away and in a similar valley. At the time, they had winds from 270 degrees at 17 knots, gusting to 28. If you're not used to thinking in runway headings, Chinle's runway, 36 points roughly north, 360 degree. So, a wind from 270 degrees is hitting the aircraft directly from the side. That's what we call a direct crosswind. And gusts to 28 knots are not small potatoes, especially at this altitude. It was also 31 degrees Celsius, about 88 degrees Fahrenheit, with a pressure setting of 30.39 inches of mercury. That combination, at 5,550 feet elevation, gives you a density altitude of roughly 8,415 feet. If you're not familiar with density altitude, It's a way of saying the airplane feels like it's flying at this higher altitude because of the thinner, hotter air. And higher density altitude means less engine power, less propeller thrust, and longer landing distances. In other words, your margins shrink. Put it together. A narrow, high-elevation runway, gusty direct crosswinds, hot temperatures, and no on-field weather to give you up-to-the-minute updates. This is the kind of scenario where even highly experienced pilots have to be laser-focused, because there's not a lot of room for error. After departing Albuquerque, the King Air flew direct toward Chinle, a pretty straightforward routing over New Mexico and into northeastern Arizona. The ADS-B track shows strong, clean data en route, but as the aircraft began setting up for arrival, that feed cuts off in the most frustrating spot for investigators, just before touchdown. The last valid ADS-B point shows the King Air at around 7,000 feet MSL, which is only about 1,450 feet above the ground in that area, moving at 199 knots. That's still relatively fast for the distance to the airport, suggesting they were in the early part of the approach, or perhaps joining the pattern. From there, nothing. The data simply stops, likely because low altitude and terrain blocked ADS-B reception. The crash site is chillingly close to the runway. The wreckage came to rest on an access road that runs parallel to the north-south runway, about 950 to 960 feet west of the center line, in line with the airport's main ramp. In other words, they were right there, just seconds from safety. Photos from the scene show the aircraft almost unrecognizable from a post-impact fire that consumed most of the fuselage. The tail section, though, is still largely intact, a common sight in high-energy crashes where the tail is furthest from the initial impact point. And here's where it gets ugly. The aircraft was carrying medical oxygen bottles. Those bottles almost certainly ruptured in the fire, feeding it with pure oxygen. That makes a fire like this go from bad to catastrophic in seconds. From the photos, the wreckage is near the windsock and some ramp buildings, which means there's a good chance at least a few people on the ground saw or heard the final moments. But here's the frustrating part. Right now, we don't know if they were on final approach, starting a go-around, or even still maneuvering in the traffic pattern. That's why the sequence is still a blank spot, and why the investigation needs those other data sources. At this stage, the NTSB is in pure evidence-gathering mode. The cockpit voice recorder, the CVR, has already been recovered and sent to Washington, D.C. for download. If you're not familiar, the CVR captures cockpit audio, pilot conversations, radio calls, and even subtle background sounds like warning chimes or changes in engine noise. Those sounds can tell investigators more than you'd think, even which checklist the crew might have been working through. There's also the chance of recovering avionics SD cards or similar memory modules from the flight displays. In modern King Airs, those can store GPS track logs, engine data, and flight parameters. The big question is whether the fire destroyed them. High heat can wipe electronics in seconds. On top of the tech, there's eyewitness testimony. Staff at the Chinle Hospital or ambulance crew waiting at the airport might have seen the approach, heard changes in engine power, or noticed the aircraft's position relative to the runway. Even a short observation can help connect the dots. The likely areas of focus are pretty clear: crosswind and gust conditions, and whether wind shear, sudden changes in wind speed or direction, played a role during the final turns. Aircraft weight and performance in those brutal density altitude conditions. How closely the crew followed standard arrival procedures and where they entered the traffic pattern. Crew communications and workload, especially since Medevac crews often juggle both flying duties and patient readiness tasks at the same time. And here's the reality check. This isn't a nice, easy investigation site. Chinle is remote. Radar coverage in the pattern area is almost non-existent. There's no control tower recording to pull. And with minimal ADS-B coverage at low level, a lot of what happened in the last seconds will have to come from the CVR, survivors on the ground, and any scraps of data the fire didn't destroy. At this stage, the only thing we can say with certainty is that this was a complex, high workload arrival into a challenging airport, and something went catastrophically wrong in those last moments. The priority now is preserving every scrap of data so investigators can give the families, colleagues, and community the answers they deserve. For the rest of us in aviation, the real takeaway right now is patience. The NTSB process is slow by design because it's about accuracy, not speed. Until that final report comes out, all we can do is study the facts we have, ask the right questions, and remember the people who were lost. 4 professionals who were doing the work of saving lives right up to their last flight. If you want to follow this investigation as new details emerge, make sure you're subscribed, because when the real findings drop, we'll break them down right here. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.